Good evening and welcome to Gunner Shot once again. In today's peek into everyday China, I'm going to discuss about the continental versus maritime debate, which frequently erupts in India. I'm doing this because the latest input suggests that we need to relook at the whole issue. Right, we all know that India is on the cusp of change and it is now emerging as a major global competitor to China. And to that extent, China is quite, very clearly there's a lot of animosity between India and China wants to sort us out in the larger sense. Okay, the other day when I was reading the South China Morning Post, I came across these two articles, widely apart, but it just came up. Right. What do these articles say? The left one talks that China and India navies vie for influence in the Indian Ocean amid border tensions. And the right article says India and China border dispute. New Delhi expects more clashes with PLA troops in Ladakh. So our continental and maritime borders are in problems. Now, this debate between what is more important, the continental domain or the maritime domain, has been on for quite some time. There is a large view which says that India is being tied down at the border to enable entry of the PLA Navy into the IOR so that the Indian influence is reduced. Initially, it was the view of a lot of international analysts, and later it caught the imagination of Indian analysts too. And to a large extent, it was right because unless we dominate the seas, we don't rise as a power. When you look at the threats per se, the situation is pretty evident. In the continental domain, we have always been under threat of external aggression from Pakistan and China. And any aggression of this nature is a threat to our territorial integrity and sovereignty. Whereas in the maritime domain, it is only safeguarding our interests. It is protection of our coastal areas, island territories, and our slocks. The maritime domain is more about our rising influence in global affairs and as a power. The threat at the top is to the territorial integrity of the nation. Such a threat has never existed in our maritime areas. Even in the colonial days, the colonialists came as traders, and the chances of a physical threat emanating are still remote in realpolitik. Now, let me discuss the maritime threat and put certain things in perspective. We all know that China talks of the string of pearls. It's been there for over a decade. China wants to protect its maritime routes in the IOR and hence increase its presence here. It also has to protect its interests in the BRI. It has also propagated a two ocean theory to achieve its superpower aspirations. Part of the second ocean in this theory is the Indian Ocean. Till such time, China does not have a seaboard in the Indian Ocean, it does not become a superpower. Okay, now there are certain issues which we have to understand Chinese actions in this area. Beijing has sent naval surveillance ships to the region. The Yuangwan series had come, coincidental with our missile launches and space launches. Recently, it held a meeting of the Indian Ocean countries so that it can expand its influence and contain India. Indonesia, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Maldives, African nations all attended. But Maldives and Australia backtracked. Many analysts believe that there will be frequent disputes between India and China in the ocean. But what disputes can take place in the ocean? There are no territorial disputes, and you can't go to war in the high seas. Ships can't fire at each other. Passage is free in the high seas, right? The BRI and the Maritime Silk Route, etc., right, which go through the Indian Ocean, will be the key arena for China to expand its influence. We know this. Can it do so? Can it enter the Indian Ocean on its own without any problems? For that, let's look at the China's coastline and the first chain of islands. What's happening around that area is of immense interest to us. South China and Vietnam have opened bilateral relations. NATO has entered the area with ties with Japan and South Korea. Japanese fighter planes have landed in Philippines. Vietnam has established outposts in the South China Sea next to the artificial islands created by China. They are at least attempting to do so. And then US is likely to return to Subic Bay. In fact, today's announcement it is returning into, and that means it's going to be square right in the middle of South China Sea. All these nations are militarizing, increasing their defense budgets to the extent that South Korea and Japan are even considering going nuclear. If all this happens, China has to start worrying about its own coastline. We have to we can never forget that the Chinese coastline is the richest part of its territory. These actions by these countries put threat on the coastline. Forget Vietnam. Now, for China to enter the IOR, it has to first get across the first chain of islands and then get across the Malacca Strait. And only then it can enter the Indian Ocean. In any case, this is not new. It's not rocket science either. What does that involve? If it has to enter the Indian Ocean, it has to get hold of bases. And where do these bases have to come? In Gwadar, Hambantota, Sonadia, or Kyakfu. This is what they are trying. Sonadia, they tried with Bangladesh, but that Bangladesh has said rejected the Chinese offer, and they've given the development of the Sonadia port to Japan. As far as the port in Myanmar is concerned, with the trouble in Myanmar and the delays with the CMEC is going on, the China-Myanmar Economic Corridor, it will be quite some time before Kyakfu can turn into anything like a naval base. That leaves us with Hambantota and Gwadar. Right. Can China operate from Hambantota and Gwadar as a base? Now let's look at this. Very recently, our foreign minister went to Sri Lanka. Why? Apart from enhancing ties with Sri Lanka, it was to marginalize China. And South China Morning Post says India spies a China-shaped hole to fill in Sri Lanka's economic crisis. Very clearly, China has lost ground in Sri Lanka and it's not going to recover in a hurry. So, operationalizing Hambantota into a naval base is a receding phenomenon, or at least a delayed phenomenon at this point of time. I've highlighted this. This is the report in South China Morning Post about the Karachi bomber, where Chinese people were killed in Karachi by the female bomber. But after that, that entire coast has been in some problem or the other. For the past 3 months, we all know that Hagdo Tariq has done a virtual sit-in around Gwadar, and everything is, just no go there. Will this improve? Given the way China is going, sorry, Pakistan is going down the chute, how long will it take for Gwadar to become a proper military base? These are all questions up in the air. China's entry into this area comes under a lot of question marks. Does PLA Navy have the capability to do so at this point of time? There are question marks on the availability of its manpower. When I say manpower, it's captains of the ships. And this was an article which came out a few weeks back. And the source of that article was a PLA magazine. They also didn't have aircraft for their aircraft carrier. They don't have bases. They have to now worry, if you look at it, which I highlighted earlier, about their coastal and mainland security. Getting across Malacca is not going to be easy. And overcoming the defenses of Andaman and Nicobar, which we are, priming, is, as per them, overcoming an iron curtain. This unsinkable aircraft carriers over 100 and what about 1,000 kilometers. And then many times we talk of China entering the IOR and doing what it wants against India. Have we thought of the threat it poses to USA and Diego Garcia? Have we thought of tying up with USA in a serious manner to marginalize the Chinese threat in the IOR? We have. That's why all these exercises. Why do you have a strategic partnership? Chinese activity in the IOR is detrimental not only to India but also to US international interests. So there's a confluence which we have to build on. Okay, let me now talk about the continental threat. Now again, these two articles from the South China Morning Post are important. Of course, the first article talks of the India-China border dispute, where Delhi is expected or should expect more clashes with PLA in Ladakh. Very logically said that based on history, etc., they will be. The right one is tricky. It says, as India asserts itself, Kashmir looks set for crucial, unpredictable few years. And this article is an eye opener if you have not read it. I would suggest people to go into it in detail. We will go if we will go into it in detail, right? It talks of estranged Kashmiris. It talks of a surge in militancy by Muslim teenagers with no previous inclination for anti-India activities. It says there is anger post article striking down of Article 370, which has catalyzed a new wave of armed violence. We know it's all untrue. It says that the next few years are crucial and unpredictable. And this is not an old article, this is a recent article. It also says explicitly that Delhi instigated a G7 backed money laundering and terrorism watchdog that placed uh, Pakistan on FATF watch list. So that means we are responsible for their being placed on the FATF. Don't stop here. It says Beijing complained in the UN Security Council about India's move to change Kashmir's status. So that's a complaint. But it says in 2020, China ordered its soldiers to encroach on previously held Indian territory in Ladakh. So for the first time, a Chinese media platform is mentioning that China undertook this the, for the reason, were it not for this intervention, India would probably have succeeded in having the Kashmir issue removed permanently from the international diplomatic agenda. So they feel a threat from us. To obviate that threat, they have done this. You think the threat to the LAC is just to tie us down after this? It is, I can't think that way. Now, there is a history between India and China in terms of these conflicts. Very funnily, when I went and plotted all the conflicts or the face offs we've had along the LAC, there's a marked rise after 2012. And every face off, incursion, or a conflict has happened either before or after a high level summit or a meeting. Let me give you a close up of this. Have a look at it. Whether it's Depsang, Demchok, Putse, Duklam, Pangangso, that's the time when, all these happened whenever there was a meeting. The last one, Mr. Modi and Xi Jinping exchanged pleasantries at the G20 summit in Indonesia, and Yangtze happened. I put this across in an article of mine, which I will refer to in the when I put this video out. There's a Chinese team in Nepal today which is just studying how to build the Himalayan railway from the Western Express Highway to Kathmandu. In a matter of about 5 to 6 years, this project will start. The thing about this project is, this project ultimately is to terminate at the foothills of Terai on the Nepal-India border, which means that PLA troops could appear one day in Terai across UP and Bihar, where we don't have any deployment, we don't have any way of doing anything we want, or rather defending our nation. And they'll push it through because you have a Maoist government today. And if you see the history of the political cycles in Nepal, uh, out of 66%, 60 to 70% of the time, you had a government in the recent past which is pro China. As a result, these such projects will go through. So the threat is no more direct, it is indirect. And it is increasing. This is the map. We know that they've already also instigated this problem in the Limkyudara and the Lipulek Pass area, which they done in 2020. That is still hanging; it's not resolved. And once this road comes to the road to Kathmandu, if it the railway track comes and if it comes down further, all the best. Okay, this is yet another interesting article. Recently, in Kunming, a couple of weeks back, China and Bhutan had talks on resolving their border. This article says they are moving closer to resolving their border issue. Right? You read this article and you'll sit up, but I'll show you an excerpt of this. The report says that the talks were very significant for Bhutan. They would be very significant for Bhutan because China has disputed nearly 25% of the country's territory and it has claimed it as its own. China has promised to relinquish its demands in the northern Bhutan if its claims in the region in the northwestern Bhutan were recognized. The third is very interesting. There is a section of population, Bhutanese population, that believes that there is an immense dependence in Bhutan on India. This section wants to resolve the dispute and have stronger ties with China to facilitate trade with it. So the Chinese influence in Bhutan is growing. Will Bhutan go the Nepal way? Point to ponder. Right? Have a close look at this map. So what are they talking of? The disputed areas are Doklam, Jakarlung and Pasarlung in the north. It's absolutely rocky, barren area. Why China did it is as a bargain counter. And then in 2020, right, they laid claim on Saktang, which is deep over 100 kilometers into the Bhutanese territory behind Tawang. Now China says we'll give up on all this, give us Doklam. Right? And that is only what they have promised. And we know how good China is at keeping its word. And can Bhutan withstand these claims? We know they can't. And if China comes and sits at Sakting, your complete defenses of Tawang are outflanked and Tawang is irrelevant. Why Sakting? Because it is contiguous to Tawang. And why Tawang? Because of the Buddhist link. Or the Dalai Lama. I think the fifth Dalai Lama was from Tawang. So that is part of Tibet. So that since that is part of Tibet, Sakting is also part of Tibet. So the claim. And this claim is now through a third party. The story doesn't end there. What about the threat from Myanmar? The China Myanmar Economic Corridor. It completely, if this goes through, it completely outflanks Indian defenses. The China Myanmar Economic Corridor might be far away. It's not going to come in a hurry. But at least from the northern part of the border, that is south of this border city of Ruli, in that Kunming area, right? China can outflank the Wolong defenses completely and reach the plains of Brahmaputra. Tirap Changlang, northern part of Nagaland, they're all vulnerable today if China undertakes something through Myanmar. Now, China has backed the revival of the Tista River. What is the Tista River project? Where is this Tista River project going to take place? Just about 15-20 kilometers south of this line Jalpaiguri Kuch Bihar. If the Chinese presence there enhances, and which is likely to, and if Bangladesh also goes under the Chinese debt trap, because we know Bangladesh has already gone to IMF and all that, and there's unrest in Bangladesh. And if the Chinese establish their presence there, and if they coerce Bhutan, we, we will be in a situation where they're sitting on in the Doklam area and also in Tista. Is it a comfortable position for us? We all know there's massive infrastructure built by the PLA across the LAC. There are border villages which are being built there, which are to serve as the logistics basis. And in areas of dispute, these border villages have come right up to the areas into the disputed areas, virtually making them their territory. So that territory is virtually denied to us. right? They are also undertaking diversion of Brahmaputra waters by building the dam at the Great Bend. Tomorrow, what if they start undertaking building a dam on in the Lohit River? These are the two major tributaries of Brahmaputra. So far, it's okay. We are not, we won't be so adversely affected by the dam at the Great Bend. But what if something more happens? Your water security is at stake. And then, of course, they've enacted this border law. So the border dispute is no more a dispute between India and China, but is a matter of territorial and integrity and sovereignty to China. So you do anything on the border, it is virtually an act of war. That is what their border law says. And let me cap all this. There's this statement in South China Morning Post ascribed to a naval officer who heads a think tank, Indian naval officer. It says it is in, he says, it is in India's larger interest to remain the guardian and net security provider in the Indian Ocean region. I agree with him completely. It is our call and we should do so. And he also qualifies being something China cannot do due to geography. So the threat is not there. Either China is a net security provider or India is a net security provider. If the Chinese geography doesn't permit it to be the net security provider here, there is no threat. I wouldn't say there's no threat. We have the upper hand. You add USA into this picture, the picture is very clear. You add the fact that China has to defend its own coastline and deal with the changed military, geopolitical, and the military situation in the South China Sea and along the first island chain. The situation is even more stark. The second statement, China cannot surprise India in the Indian Ocean. So there's no surprise there. What happened at the line of actual control cannot happen in the maritime domain. So that means the maritime domain is safe. He's right. At the LAC, you can be surprised. The threat could be direct or indirect or insidious. And your territorial integrity and sovereignty is at stake every single day and increasing. As I see in the past 2 years, if you see the plots of the direct and the indirect threats, it has increased incrementally. Salami slicing of different varieties. There is also legal salami slicing, there is a physical salami slicing or attempts to do so. So we need to relook at the politics of the LAC. China views the LAC as a political issue. We view it as a military issue. So there's a difference. There's a difference in approach. We need to revisit the Tibet issue. We need to revisit the Tibet issue very subtly. Because the Dalai Lama has already accepted or given the middle path. Or rather, he's propounded the middle path. We can't do anything beyond that middle path. But there is many things we can do below the middle path. One. Second, the Chinese have violated the 2003 mutual agreement many times. That is the foundational agreement by which we have recognized Tibet. So, is there a time? Is it the time to show a red card there, like we did with One China? We have to do something. Should we redefine our operational strategy to make it more proactive? On, I will say, redefine our operational strategy to make it less reactive. Should we always react, or we should Tell them, you do this, we'll do that, and make it explicit. At some point of time, force matters. At every point of time, the comprehensive national power of a nation does not win wars. If that was so, USA would not have been defeated by slipper toting Taliban, or Ukraine wouldn't have been tied down by Russia. We should stop talking this nonsense called comprehensive national power and enhance our military power so that China knows that we mean business. We have been saying that we are getting tied down at the LAC. If we start thinking of tying the PLA down on the LAC so that China's global ambitions cannot be realized, China will start thinking differently. So it comes to the last question. Is there a need for rebalance? My view is that over the past 3 to 4 years, we have gone or swung a little more towards the maritime domain. I have no problem with it. We have to rule the seas to become a big power or rise as a nation. But it cannot be at the cost of our continental domain where we are bound to lose our territorial integrity and sovereignty. There are our people there. 3 years back, 4 years back, the threat through Nepal, Bhutan, Bangladesh, and Myanmar was not so explicit as it is today. 3 years back, we were not clear as to why China did what it did in Pangong Tso, but today this article clarifies it. So there is a requirement of a rebalance. There's a requirement of an introspection. There's a requirement of a revisit of our operational thinking. And there's a requirement of resetting our ties. I will not say that we should go back and that the continental domain should dominate. I think there's a clear case of a 50-50 look. And then maybe go 51-49 to one side, depending on the evolving situation. But you cannot have what is going on today. With this, I'll leave you. I'll be very interested in feedback from the larger strategic community and others too. Unless we debate these issues, we will not have the right answers. Am I right in my postulation? I might not be. I might be completely wrong, and I'm prepared to accept it. But I have raised some questions which we need to answer for ourselves. Thank you and Jai Hind.